Silence
Thank you
hung
for
over the
joining us
chamber
today.
like a weight
We're
no one
here to
wanted
discuss
touch.
some
The
important
kind that
updates.
settles only after too many days
Thank you
of
for joining us
posturing and
today.
procedural
We're
fog.
here to discuss
The
some
lights
important
above felt
updates.
harsher than usual, bleaching every expression into something raw and unguarded. Members shifted in their seats, some pretending to review notes, others staring straight ahead as if bracing for a storm they hoped wouldn't come. But everyone sensed it. Something was cracking beneath the surface. Then Jasmine Crockett spoke. Her sentence wasn't loud, but it carried with the kind of moral certainty that slices cleanly through exhaustion and cynicism. Heads snapped up. A pen clattered to the floor somewhere behind her. Even the cameras seemed to pause, focusing in on the steadiness in her eyes, the unshakable resolve in her tone. For a moment, no one breathed. Across the chamber, Brian Schatz tilted his head, recognizing instantly that this was not another routine exchange. A flicker of admiration crossed his face. The quiet kind, the kind that says, "There it is, the truth breaking through." But the real shock was still coming, and when it hit, the room would be forced to confront what they'd tried to ignore. What unfolded in that chamber didn't appear out of thin air. It had been building for weeks, a slow, grinding pressure that tightened a little more every time a hearing dragged on, every time a procedural detour swallowed the truth, every time Jasmine Crockett absorbed another thinly veiled jab delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut. People watching from the outside saw only the headlines. Those inside the room felt the accumulation like humidity before a storm. You don't always see the lightning coming, but you feel the air change. Crockett had endured the delays, the circular arguments, the strategic objections meant to wear her down. She answered each one with the same focus, even as some colleagues muttered under their breath or leaned back with performative sighs. By the third session of the week, it was clear this wasn't about a single issue anymore. It was about whether the chamber still had space for honesty, or whether the noise would swallow everything whole. Brian Schatz had noticed it too. He watched the dynamic shift, watched Crockett hold her ground as the atmosphere thickened with impatience and ego. There was a moment earlier that day when he'd leaned forward, sensing a tipping point approaching, the kind that doesn't announce itself but arrives all at once. And when it did, when Crockett chose to cut through the fog with unflinching clarity, the reaction wasn't simply about her words. It was the release of every unspoken frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface. But what happened next would force the entire chamber and the entire country to pick a side. Long before the chamber reached its breaking point, the opposing force had already taken shape, not as a single face or a single voice, but as a pattern, a rhythm, a familiar choreography of condescension that Jasmine Crockett had learned to recognize the way sailors learn to read storms. It was a coalition stitched together not by shared purpose, but by shared disdain, rising whenever accountability crept too close. They moved in small gestures, an eye roll timed to interrupt, a chuckle slipped under someone else's sentence, a question asked not to learn, but to belittle. None of it loud enough to be procedural misconduct, but all of it loud enough to poison the room. They thrived on performative outrage, the kind that lights up social clips but dies the moment any real substance enters the conversation. One day they'd rail against overspending. The next, they'd defend an extravagance of their own with a shrug. They called for civility, then shattered it with a wink. They condemned the vice of rhetoric, then crafted their own carefully calibrated jabs, dripping with implication but void of responsibility. Their contradictions weren't accidents, they were tactics. Flashbacks of previous sessions flickered through Crockett's mind like quick cuts in a documentary. One member interrupting Crockett mid-sentence with a feigned concern about tone, another mischaracterizing her arguments moments after she'd made them, a third pretending not to hear her clarification only to repeat the same falsehood minutes later. The strategy was always the same: unsettle, minimize, distract. But behind those theatrics was something more fragile, an insecurity disguised as superiority. Every smirk, every dismissive shrug, every exaggerated sigh revealed how desperately they needed control of the narrative, how threatened they felt by anyone who challenged the illusion of their authority. Crockett had seen that fragility up close. It was the same look she had confronted countless times before, the quiet panic beneath arrogance. And now, in the present moment, that coalition sensed the balance shifting. Their usual tactics weren't landing. Their practiced smirks twitched at the edges. Their interruptions faltered before leaving their lips. A reckoning was coming for them, not through vengeance, but through truth spoken clearly enough to expose everything they had tried to obscure. And they had no idea just how close that moment already was. Long before Jasmine Crockett stepped into the chamber where attentions now threatened to split the room in half, her path had been carved by moments that demanded strength long before she had titles or microphones. She learned early what it meant to stand in spaces not built with her in mind. Classrooms where her confidence was mistaken for defiance, neighborhoods where justice felt unevenly distributed, conversations where she had to explain her own existence before she could contribute her voice. These weren't just memories, they became the early threads of the backbone she would need for everything to come. As she grew, those lessons sharpened rather than softened her. She carried them into college, where she volunteered in community centers and legal aid clinics, absorbing stories from people who had been overlooked, ignored, or pushed aside by systems that promised fairness but practiced something else. She didn't just listen, she cataloged every injustice like a spark waiting for ignition. That's where she began to realize that the law, rigid as it could also be a weapon, if wielded by someone unafraid to confront its failings. Her legal career began not with glamour, but with grit. Long nights, overstuffed case files, clients who had been told 100 times to lower their expectations. She fought for them anyway. She brought the same energy to every courtroom, the calm, precise fire that made even seasoned attorneys glance over when she rose to speak. She was never loud for the sake of it. She was only loud when the truth demanded amplification. Every victory came with a cost, and she paid it willingly. Sleep sacrificed, weekends surrendered, moments with family traded for the chance to tip the scales a little closer to even. But the sacrifices didn't harden her. They focused her. They taught her to filter out distractions, to cut through noise, to name things others tiptoed around. That clarity became her trademark, a steadying presence in a political landscape addicted to chaos. When she eventually stepped into public office, she brought the same unshakable devotion, the same refusal to be minimized, the same conviction that justice wasn't an abstract ideal, but a daily obligation. And now, standing in that chamber, facing the familiar blend of arrogance and resistance, she wasn't intimidated, she wasn't rattled, she wasn't unsure, she was ready. And everything she had endured prepared her for the moment that was about to ignite. Back in the chamber, the air had shifted. What had begun as a simmer was now edging toward a full boil, the kind of pressure that makes every breath feel heavier. The coalition of obstruction sensed the vulnerability of the moment and reacted the only way they knew how, with snide remarks tucked inside faux politeness and gestures so dismissive they might as well have been shouted. One member leaned back in their chair with theatrical exaggeration. Another whispered loudly enough for microphones to catch the cadence, if not the words. It was all designed to provoke, to unsettle, to push Jasmine Crockett off balance. But she didn't move. Not a flinch, not a glance, not a hint that the barbs were landing. She sat with the stillness of someone who had weathered storms far more violent than petty theatrics. Her composure only irritated the antagonists further, their comments growing bolder, their interruptions multiplying. At one point, a procedural objection was raised with the flimsiest reasoning imaginable, a transparent attempt to derail the discussion and reclaim control. It failed, but not before stealing a handful of seconds from the room, like someone flicking the lights to break concentration. Crockett didn't take the bait. She waited. She observed. And when she resumed speaking, her voice was even steadier than before, as if the chaos around her had only clarified her purpose. That restraint, that calm, became its own kind of power. People in the gallery leaned forward. Even those accustomed to tuning out the noise found themselves watching her with renewed focus. There was a growing awareness, a murmur under the surface, that the chamber was inching towards something it wasn't prepared for. The antagonists sensed it too. Their confidence wavered in small, involuntary ways. A pen tapped too quickly. A throat cleared a little too hard. A stare held a second too long. They'd come expecting to dominate the room through the usual tactics. Instead, they found themselves confronting a force they hadn't accounted for. A turning point was on the horizon, brighter and sharper than any of them anticipated. But none of them expected the fire she was about to unleash. When Jasmine Crockett finally leaned forward, the chamber fell into an uneasy stillness, as if the walls themselves understood that something irreversible was about to happen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words emerged with a calm so intentional it cut deeper than any shouted argument, each sentence measured, like a blade drawn with practiced precision. At first, the coalition opposite her attempted their usual tactic, dismissive smirks, the small scoffs meant to suggest her point wasn't worth taking seriously. But as she continued, the expressions began to shift. Her clarity was undeniable, the kind that made even the boldest detractor freeze for fear of looking foolish in comparison. She laid out the contradictions they'd been hiding behind, exposing the thin threads holding their arguments together. Every line she delivered landed with the weight of accumulated truth, the kind that doesn't need embellishment because the facts themselves are powerful enough. A soft gasp fluttered from somewhere in the gallery. Crockett didn't acknowledge it. She kept going, each statement more precise than the last. She called out the selective outrage, the sudden procedural purity that only appeared when it served certain agendas. She highlighted the pattern, the interruptions, the theatrics, the deliberate waste of time, not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who had cataloged the behavior long before stepping into this room. And as she spoke, the chamber tightened around her words, as though space itself was rearranging to make room for the truth that could no longer be ignored. Across the dais, one antagonist shifted uncomfortably, jaw tightening. Another stared down at their notes as though ink might offer an escape. Even their usual whispering had ceased. The coalition that had entered the debate so confidently now appeared frail, exposed under a spotlight they hadn't expected. The camera angles caught everything, the darting eyes, the forced stillness, the carefully composed faces cracking at the edges. Silence isn't always submission, but in this moment it was unmistakably defeat. Crockett paused, deliberately, letting the weight of her words settle across the chamber. She didn't revel in the discomfort. She didn't gloat. She simply allowed the truth to exist without interruption. That restraint made the moment feel even sharper. Anyone watching could sense the shift. The balance of the room had moved decisively, and there was no returning to the earlier pretense. Then she delivered the line that would replay endlessly in clips, a sentence so sharp, so exact, that it severed the last strand of credibility her opposition had been clinging to. It was the kind of statement that didn't require volume to resonate. It needed only courage and clarity, and she had both in abundance. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The chamber froze. Even the air seemed afraid to move. One member blinked slowly, as if recalibrating reality. Another sat back, shoulders dropping in resigned acknowledgement. The gallery, packed, silent, felt like an audience suspended just before the climax of a film. And then, from the opposite side of the room, Brian Schatz stood. He didn't look around for permission. He didn't wait to see who might join him. He rose with the certainty of someone who recognized the magnitude of what had just occurred. A smile, small but undeniable, crossed his face, the kind that conveyed respect, recognition, and relief all at once. And then he brought his hands together in deliberate, echoing applause. The sound rang through the chamber with startling clarity. One clap, then another, then a cascade, each applauding building on the last, reshaping the atmosphere in real time. The tension that had dominated the space began to break apart under the weight of validation, under the acknowledgement that Crockett had not just defended herself, she had defended the integrity of the chamber itself. For the coalition that had spent weeks trying to undermine her, their unraveling was almost palpable. Stiffened postures, forced neutrality, the unmistakable flicker of recognition that they had been outmatched, not by volume or aggression, but by unbreakable conviction. Crockett didn't turn to look at Schatz. She didn't need to. The applause spoke for itself. It told the chamber and anyone watching that what she had done mattered, that truth still had champions willing to stand up for it in a room where courage was often optional. Her calm remained unshaken, though a quiet fire burned behind her eyes, the kind that only appears when someone knows they've finally said what needed saying. And as the applause continued, rippling outward like waves breaking against the shore, something else began to stir, beyond the chamber, beyond the moment, beyond the walls that contained it. Because while the room had erupted in its own way, it was nothing compared to what was coming next. But the chamber wasn't the only place that erupted. The moment the clip hit the internet, everything fractured at once, in the best way possible. One account posted the exact 8 seconds of Jasmine Crockett's mic drop line, and within minutes, it spread like wildfire, ricocheting across timelines faster than anyone in the chamber could have imagined. Hashtags horned instantly, climbing the ranks until they dominated every trending column. People weren't just sharing the moment. They were celebrating it, dissecting it, replaying it like a scene they'd been waiting years to watch. Reaction videos sprouted everywhere. Teenagers filmed duets where their jaws dropped in perfect sync with Crockett's takedown. Elders who'd lived through decades of political disappointment recorded themselves nodding slowly, eyes shining with recognition. Commentators scrambled to get clips posted early, hoping to ride the wave of attention. Some framed it as a masterclass in composure, others as a pivotal shift in the tone of modern debates. Even creators who usually posted cooking tutorials or dance challenges paused their usual content to weigh in. The clip became more than a political moment. It became cultural currency. Memes followed, layered with quotes from her speech, side-by-side frames of the antagonist's stunned expressions, and animated edits where Crockett's final line dropped in slow motion over cinematic soundtracks. Some users clipped the moment Schatz stood to applaud, adding captions like, "When the truth hits too clean to ignore," or "This is what real leadership looks like." Those edits shaded across generational lines, stitched together by students, workers, retirees, all united by that shared spark of recognition. Politicians chimed in, some offering praise, others cautiously acknowledging the significance without daring to say the quiet part out loud. Journalists debated whether the moment signaled a shift in the chamber's balance. A few celebrities, actors, musicians, writers, reposted the clip with commentary ranging from admiration to awe. Suddenly, the debate wasn't confined to a single committee room. It had rippled outward, saturating every corner of public conversation. And threaded through all these reactions was a single sentiment. People felt seen. They felt represented. They felt energized in a way that made them revisit the clip again and again, as though each replay reaffirmed something inside them that had been waiting for permission to rise. But this wave was only the beginning, and its force was still gathering speed. When the applause finally softened into silence, something deeper lingered in the chamber, a recognition that the moment had transcended arguments, agendas, and the ritual choreography of confrontation. Brian Schatz's standing ovation wasn't just a signal of support. It was a quiet, powerful declaration that courage still mattered in a system that often tried to grind it down. His gesture cut through the cynicism that usually clouded the room, reminding everyone present that truth, when spoken with integrity, still had the capacity to shift the atmosphere. Jasmine Crockett didn't bask in the attention. She didn't need to. Instead, she took a slow breath and allowed her words to settle into something larger than the exchange that sparked them. Her closing remarks were measured, deliberate, and grounded not in victory, but in purpose. She reminded the chamber that dignity doesn't need permission to stand tall, that respect is not earned through intimidation, and that clarity thrives where chaos fails. Her tone carried neither triumph nor resentment, only conviction. She spoke about the responsibility of public service, about the duty to elevate rather than diminish, to question without dehumanizing, to debate without erasing the people those debates ultimately affect. Her words didn't scold, they illuminated. She reframed the confrontation as a reminder of the values the institution was meant to uphold, values that too often got lost beneath the noise. And as she spoke, even those who had bristled at her earlier found themselves listening, if only because honesty delivered with grace is difficult to dismiss. By the time she finished, the chamber felt different, lighter, steadier, as though someone had opened a window after a long season of stale air. Brian Shaughnessy's applause had marked the turning point, but Crockett's final message cemented it. The insistence that public service could still reflect courage, that leadership could still mean accountability, that truth could still cut through the static and inspire something better. This is what it looks like when dignity refuses to yield. This is what it looks like when clarity steadies the room. This is what public service looks like. This is what America can be. Long after the echoes faded, the image remained. Brian Schatz rising in full view of the chamber, offering applause that carried far beyond its walls. It wasn't just a reaction. It was a recognition of everything the moment represented. Courage, clarity, the insistence that truth still deserves a standing ovation. And as Jasmine Crockett stood firm beneath that wave of approval, something unmistakable crystallized. This is what it looks like when integrity refuses to shrink. If that moment moved you, if it reminded you of what leadership can still be, then this space is yours. A place for people who believe in accountability, in decency, in voices that refuse to be dimmed. Join in, stay engaged, share this story forward. Let it ripple outward the same way that applause did, bold, honest, and impossible to ignore. The work continues, and you are part of it.